Hello there lovely people, it's Alex from Nintendo Life here, and today I'm going to be taking a closer look at some retro USB controllers that are styled after Nintendo controllers, primarily these ones. Oh, and these ones. The gang's all here. All of these things come in these rather nice boxes that bear the branding of the manufacturer. Big thanks to RetroLink for sending these over, by the way, and indeed you can just put these up on a shelf. But really, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be using them to play some old games. Simply plug one of these puppies into your PC, Mac, or even Raspberry Pi, basically anything that can take a USB controller, and start playing some retro games. Anyway, enough twaddle, let's get these puppies out of their boxes. I'm going to go chronologically, so let's start off with the NES/Famicom controller. It's basically what you'd expect. I mean, you can't really get much wrong with two buttons, a D-pad, a start and a select button. The buttons themselves are nice and responsive, the start and select buttons have that sort of rubbery feel to them, which is nice, and the D-pad feels as solid as any Nintendo one. Now with this one, I have to admit I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because I've never used an original NES controller. They just weren't popular over here in the UK. But the controls feel as responsive as you'd expect from any controller, and really, I can't fault it. Now let's get onto a controller I actually have used the original version of, the SNES controller. Again, like the NES controller, the buttons are all lovely and responsive, the D-pad feels great. This is actually modelled after the US version, or the North American version if you like, with the concave buttons on the X and Y. It really feels like they must have used the original molds or something on this, because the whole unit really just feels like a SNES controller. It's almost flawless. The only thing I would say about this controller is the fact that the shoulder buttons put up a little bit more resistance than the original, but they do feel more precise than the original as well, so you can't really complain. Let's move on to what I would consider to be the big daddy of this set, and that is the N64 controller. This controller is infamous because it's got three handles and it basically looks like it was not designed for human hands, but I absolutely love it. This USB iteration though, I have to say is almost slightly better than the original, which is something I really didn't think I'd be saying. Much like the SNES's shoulder buttons, all the buttons have a little bit more resistance to them, the start button's a little bit further out than I think it was on the original, but the biggest thing about this is the control stick, and this is far and away better than the original. It may well be that my original controllers are all just a little bit knackered, but this control stick just feels so much more responsive and it feels like it's actually got some weight to it. And playing some games, it functions really well and it doesn't have that weird, imprecise nature that you got with some of the N64 games. The D-pad on this one isn't as good as it is on the other controllers, but considering it's on the N64, you're not really going to be using it. Now, lastly, let's move on to the most updated controller, the GameCube controller. I have to admit I'm a little bit disappointed by this one actually. Everything feels a little bit chunkier. I think the controls are slightly higher than they were on the original, even the control stick. The L and R buttons put up a huge amount of resistance. The Z button has been changed into this really cheap clicky thing. The buttons are chunkier, as I said before. The C stick doesn't feel quite as good. It's just sort of cheap and plasticky. It's just not as good as the others, and it's a real shame. Having said all that, this is still perfectly usable. It is certainly not a deal breaker, and it's still a fantastic controller. And it feels absolutely rock solid. All of these feel incredibly robust, even more so than the originals, and that may be why they feel a little bit chunkier than the originals. It may well be that they're using a slightly thicker plastic. That is no bad thing. Build quality is incredibly important when it comes to these sort of controllers, particularly if you're going to be throwing them across the room like some people I know. All of these controllers also light up with LEDs hidden inside the housing, which may be something that interests you, but to be honest, it doesn't really bother me. Realistically, I just want a good-looking, solid controller, and these look good enough even without the LEDs on. Unfortunately, another mark against the GameCube controller, you can't turn the LEDs off, they're just constantly blue. I don't know why. To summarise then, these are all fantastic controllers, and in some cases like the N64, even surpassing the original. The GameCube controller is a little bit disappointing, but it's still far and away the best unofficial GameCube controller that I've ever used. And so, to celebrate, I'm going to adorn myself with all of these lovely controllers for the final shot. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, then why don't you press A on that subscribe button, and be sure to check out NintendoLife.com for all sorts of lovely Nintendo-related content. Thank you again for watching. Bye-bye. Get on the floor.